to Rev Reviews, the podcast where we talk about a variety of books from a Marxist and anarchist perspective. And I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Clark. Thanks for joining me, Justin.
Hi, Corey. It's great to be here. It's always good to be chatting books with you and doing this show. It's very exciting to be here tonight. We had a very fun pregame.
For sure.
Kind of talking a variety of different things. So I encourage people, if they want to hear the pregame, definitely become a patron. Keep the lights on for us. But there have been things in the news that have kind of been almost kismet for the book we're going to be talking about tonight. One of them is that there are two astronauts stuck in space due to failures with a Boeing spacecraft. They were only supposed to be up there, I think, like 8 days or something. And they're not going to be home until probably early 25 because of the problems with that particular spacecraft that Boeing made.
Yeah.
You see the growth of the sort of dark underbelly of American imperialism in the continued humanitarian crisis in Gaza, that the U.S. continues to send weapons. Just this week, the UK Labour Party, who have power for the first time in 14 years, voted to get rid of the pensioners' fuel allowance for the winter coming. And by the way, that's the Labour Party, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the Labour Party doing
that's supposed to be. Yeah, that's not the right-wing party, supposedly.
That's not the right-wing party.
Somehow.
And what ties all of these things together it does really feel like we live in an era of crisis. It feels like there's a real sense of crisis where, and I think it's part of the reason why it's hard for people to organize and to establish, mutual aid or other solidarity campaigns, is because we feel like in a sense of crisis that, as not just as workers but as people. That the world is constantly shifting under our feet and we don't really have much control over it.
Yeah.
And that is the consequences of the economic order that we live under, the political economic order, and that is neoliberalism. We've talked about neoliberalism before on the show. We've talked about David Harvey's excellent book on neoliberalism, which kind of laid out some of it. We'll kind of touch upon those themes again tonight. But our book tonight kind of goes into a lot of this, in that the argument is often, the sort of libertarian or right libertarian argument that you hear, or the neoliberal argument that you hear is it's, less government, more freedom. This is something you'll hear all the time. The right often have discussions. They're constantly talking about freedom or liberty or rights. Those things are constantly talked about.
Yeah.
But when in reality, we have very little freedom in the system that we live in. Very little freedom at all. And so tonight's book is Vulture, Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom by Grace Blakeley.
Cool.
I love this book. We've covered a previous book of hers on the show, Stolen. Yeah. So this is sort of a good sequel to that. I highly recommend people check out Stolen. It's another really good book by her. This is her best book yet. I think she makes the argument that I've wanted someone to make for so long, and I've been making myself, which is that the system we live under is deeply unfree. And contrary to what the people on TV say, we live in an extremely planned economy.
Yeah.
It's just planned in the service of capital and not of workers.
Yeah.
So Grace Blakeley is a British author. She is a graduate of the University of Oxford. She has a degree in philosophy and economics and politics. She has a master's degree in Africana studies, and she writes for Tribune magazine, which is sort of the Jacobin of Britain.
Okay.
She writes for the New Statesman, and she's also written for Novara Media, which is another really great alternative media company in the UK. And she is very, very good at sort of laying out the problem with the heart of the sort of economic political order that we live in, which is neoliberalism, is that the story that we're told is that big oppressive government will limit the rights of people, and therefore it's good to limit government. Now, on its face, that's a decent argument, right?
Yep.
That we limit what the state can and cannot do. I think that's a very good thing. I think that When it comes to people's personal lives, so long as they're not violating the rights of others, people should have the freedom to pursue their lives as they see fit. They should be able to pursue consensual relationships with others as they see fit. They should be able to pursue their own healthcare needs, regardless of what people's moral posturings are about, especially in relation to, say, like abortion or trans healthcare.
Yep.
And so there's a good argument to be made that we limit the rights of the state. The problem is neoliberalism does not do that. It fundamentally doesn't.
Right.
And what neoliberalism does is it actually creates more government, but it's in service of those who own the society, i.e. capital. And so what is a good example of this? So in the book, she lays out many great sort of like anecdotal stories, great different little stories here and there to convey broader points. But she has a great section in the book about Boeing. And the story of Boeing is one that is, I think, very common in the history of American political economy, especially under neoliberalism. So Boeing was, is well over 100 years old. It was sort of considered a blue chip company. It was a company that prized its work to a greater or lesser extent, prized its workers. It prized its engineering prowess. It didn't cut corners. It didn't make sort of risky bets. It was always sort of a strong company that was very much tied into the state. And what really changed the culture of Boeing was what happened in the 1990s when they merged with a firm called McDonnell Douglas.
Okay.
Now, McDonnell Douglas was a firm that was the developer of the DC-10, which is their own commercial aircraft, but they were also mostly involved in military aircraft. They built mostly that.
Okay. When
McDonnell Douglas merged with Boeing, the leadership of McDonnell Douglas took over Boeing. And so when the guys who ran McDonnell Douglas took over Boeing, they radically shifted the culture of the company away from, long-term sustainable growth, good engineering, good safety standards to, growing the stock price at any cost. So the
enshittification of Boeing.
The enshittification of Boeing, real time. So, and the guy who was really responsible for a lot of this was a guy named Harry Stonecipher, who was kind of he was very much like he was the Jack Welch of Boeing, who had run McDonnell Douglas. Now, Jack Welch, for those of you who don't know, one of the great villains of American history. He's one of those guys, I think he's dead, and I'm glad he's dead. He was a terrible human being. But he ran GM for a very, very long time. And his goal when he took over GE, General Electric, was to move it away from being a company that sort of made things to a company that had financial products. And this is the thing you see. This is a core component of neoliberalism, is the financialization of the economy. So companies like General Electric, Boeing, General Motors, they start making more and more of their balance sheet, their positive balance sheet, by having more financialized components of their businesses. GE was like this, where they made far more money moving money around than they ever did making things. And that was GM to a certain extent too. But Boeing was kind of in that business. So it was a lot of cost cutting, a lot of, quarter to quarter, this is what we care about, is the quarter to quarter, this sort of shareholder supremacy. In the golden age of American capitalism, post-World War II, up until the early 1970s, there was generally a conception that there were multiple stakeholders in the economy. As we mentioned in the pregame, John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist, called them systems of countervailing power. So you had multiple different stakeholders in a system. There wasn't just one. And so, back in the day when people would say things like what's good for General Electric is good, or General Motors is good for America, like they meant that, where, the people who were at stake were obviously like the shareholders, but it was also their workers, the broader public, and the society at large. So all of those things were taken into consideration in a corporate firm for the most part. And again, this is very limited, right?
Right.
It's not like they were absolutely perfect, but it was a much more responsible governance model than the one that developed under neoliberalism, which is the only thing we care about is the stock price or the shareholder return. That's the only thing we care about. We don't care about customers. We don't care about workers. We don't care about the public, the broader public, the public good. We don't care about any of that. So what's good for the shareholders is good for the company and everybody else. And this led to a tremendous amount of problems with Boeing, where they developed, something called the 737 MAX, which was kind of a disaster. It had much larger engines, but it didn't really have the kind of capacity to handle those larger engines. And so they had to build in this computer system, which was called MCAS, or Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. It's very generic, but it would sort of automatically pitch up a plane.
Right.
But the problem is, as somebody describes it in the book, like, if you shift that ever so slightly away, then the plane, like, you lose your altitude and the plane kind of gets messed up. And the MCAS system kicks in whether the pilots want it or not.
Yeah.
So Boeing used to be a company that was very pilot-centric, where they would pilot and engineer-centric, where the pilots, whatever the pilots wanted to know or what it needed to have in order to fly a plane effectively, Boeing would make sure that that was the case. That's no longer the case now. Pilots are all, in many ways, discarded, and a lot of pilots don't really even get good training. Some of them barely get training in the way they should, and they're horrifically overworked and underpaid. Like, it's piloting. Being a pilot used to be a very solid, very middle class profession, and it's much more precarious. And that's something to think about when we think about neoliberalism too, is it creates an economy that's extremely precarious, and that's where you hear the term like the precariat.
Oh yeah.
And so all of these different issues, but despite all these problems, they would have, quarter to quarter growth. They would do a bunch of stock buybacks. What stock buybacks are is when a corporation will actually buy up some of its shares of its own stock using its profits in order to juice the stock price. Because if there are fewer shares out on the market, then supply and demand, they're worth more. So before the 1980s, stock buybacks were illegal. They weren't something you could do. They were seen as market manipulation, which is what they are. Right. But under the reforms of Reagan in the 1980s, they became legal and pretty much standard operating procedure. A lot of companies will do this all the time. They will buy back their shares with their profits. They'll jack the stock price and everybody's happy. Well, the shareholders are happy, the executives are happy, and everybody else is kind of left holding the bag.
Yeah, that's right.
The other issue with Boeing was that they were not particularly well regulated. They had a very, I would imagine, is anything, any other word to describe it would not be sufficient. It was truly a sweetheart deal where the regulators of Boeing, who were technically supposed to work for the FAA, the federal agency devoted to regulating airlines and airplanes, were paid by Boeing.
Right.
So the regulators were paid by Boeing to regulate Boeing. How that's not a conflict of interest, I have no idea.
Yeah, no.
So, and of course, all of this also goes in hand in hand with the sort of the melding of the corporation and the state. This is the other thing that's crucial to her book, which is that there's this idea that there's government and then there's the free market. This is like a thing you'll often hear.
Yeah.
The free market. The free market is a fiction. It's a fairy tale. It's a story that people tell themselves because capitalism is not free markets. No. It's not even really markets. Markets existed before capitalism and they'll exist after capitalism.
Yeah.
What capitalism really is the private ownership of the means of production. And it is predicated on the accumulation of capital or surplus value. Yeah. That is what capitalism is. And so people have been bought into this notion that the free market is like this thing that we should sort of prize at all costs. But we don't really have a free market. And the way that we know that is the real deep connections between huge corporations and the government.
Yeah.
So she talks a lot about in the book about really two particular crises that happened within living memory within the last 20 years that really highlight that connection between the corporations and the state. The first is the 2008 financial crisis, which some people couldn't see coming most people couldn't see coming, but some people did. Specifically an economist named Nouriel Roubini, who wrote another really great book called Crisis Economics, and he laid out, he's like, yes, this is bound to fall apart. Now, why did the financial crisis happen? It happened for a variety of reasons, but the main one was it was tied to financialization. In the 1930s, under the New Deal, there was a key piece of banking legislation called the Glass-Steagall Act.
Right.
And the Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banks from investment banks. So if you wanted to, commercial bank is your regular everyday bank. You go in, you have your checking account, your savings account. You may have a CD. You might have some T-bonds. You go in, that's where you get your mortgage. That's where you get your car bill, whatever, car note, whatever. And then there's investment banks, and investment banks are extremely risky and volatile. They kind of play a lot more fast and loose with money. And when Glass-Steagall was repealed in 1999, the investment and commercial banks were sort of melded all into one another. And so you had a company like AIG, the American Investment Group, they were taking on more and more financial liabilities that they couldn't really handle. And ultimately, the firm failed and had to be bailed out by the government. And this is a very key feature of neoliberalism, which is that corporations are really three things. They're too big to fail, and that if you let them fail, the whole system falls with it. Right. It hurts a lot of people. They're too big to jail, in that these people almost never see any kind of prosecution for what they do. Yep. The only people in America who ever suffer consequences for financial crime are those who screwed over other rich people. So if you look at like Elizabeth Holmes, for example, the lady who founded Theranos and committed massive fraud, or Bernie Madoff, who she talks about in the book, who led a decades-long Ponzi scheme, the largest Ponzi scheme in American history. These people screwed over other rich people, and that's how they were taken down. Regular John Q. Public, who has meager savings, and most of his money or her money is tied into a house. Yeah, most Americans, their money is tied into their homes. That's me, and so the housing bubble was sort of built. It was this sort of Pandora's box of horrific deregulation of the financial industry, connected with federally backed financial instruments. When the whole thing collapsed, because they were giving people loans that they couldn't pay, they were then divvying up those loans and turning them into different types of financial instruments, things like CDOs, or consolidated debt obligations, or credit default swaps, or collateralized debt. So you could sort of do anything you wanted with them. And that was what the era of the 90s and the early 2000s was really all about. It was about the sort of growth of these really intricate financial dealings. And the whole thing collapses. And there's a huge public bailout. And so the public is tasked with paying off all of these horrible institutions, which should have failed. They should have been allowed to fail. Yeah. And then, or at the very least, they should have been nationalized, where the federal government fully took them over, fired everybody at the top, and then, in our ideal world, make them public institutions. I mean, banking should be a public thing anyway. But or at the very least, that they would have very, very tight reins on what they could and couldn't do. And that's not really what happened. So, and then you also have, on top of all of that, you have the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States. You also have the Bank of England, which is the central bank in the UK, that would pour billions of dollars or even trillions of dollars into the economy, but not to the public. So it was a form of Keynesianism, but one that was related not to like giving people money or like putting people back to work, like a la the New Deal, but it was in service of propping up these horrifically irresponsible corporations that, if we had allowed them to fail, would drag the entire economy down with it. And the other instance of this, of course, was the COVID pandemic, COVID-19. Mm-hmm. During the pandemic, there was a tremendous amount of federal money being sloshed around, both through the Federal Reserve and through the Treasury Department. to prop up industries. Now, it was more, you can make the argument that it was maybe a little more concerned with regular people in terms of like direct cash payments. You had the PPP program, but the PPP program itself, the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP loans, which were ultimately forgiven, right?
Yeah.
A lot of them were forgiven.
A lot of them went to like executives and they laid people off anyway.
Exactly. And that's the case with a lot of the banking institutions too. They get this huge federal bailout, or GM, when General Motors got the huge federal bailout for the auto industry, they ended up taking all that money and then they gave their executives golden parachutes and they laid off thousands of people.
Yeah.
So, you know, and ideally in a democratic society and healthy society, like GM would have been retooled to, I don't know, build like high-speed rail lines and solar panels and like, you know, instead of building big-ass trucks, which are terrible for the environment and that kill little kids when they get driven over them. So yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the way that the neoliberal state works, it's constant public buttressing of corporations at the expense of everyone else. It socializes the losses and privatizes the gains.
Yeah.
And so instead of priming the pump, as it were, in order to serve the broader public's interest, whether it be employment programs or infrastructure or whatever, it mostly goes into the hands of corporations. Same with tax breaks. Many corporations effectively pay no taxes because they either have offshore accounts where they sort of move money around or move profits around to different countries. Because again, they're multinationals; they can do that. Yeah. You know, and so you have that too. So the problem of being able to tax them is a huge issue. You had recently written a really good essay for your patrons where you talked about how the tax burden is mostly shouldered on working class people, and that's true. Yeah. In the United States, you know, for the first time, pretty much in its history, for the most part, that the lion's share of tax revenue is from the middle and working classes. It's not from the rich.
Yeah.
So there's been this great shift in tax burden in America over the last 40, 50 years, from corporations and wealthy individuals to working people. And so we see this again and again where it's crisis after crisis after crisis. And instead of sort of taking a big picture look and saying, why are we continuing to do it this way? We just kind of continue to do business as usual. And it's truly at the expense of the environment. It's at the expense of workers, and it's at the expense of democracy, because as we see rising levels of inequality and the concentrations of wealth, you also see concentrations of power.
Yeah. And
so you see in ways in which the state completely is co-opted by corporate interests. I think that's a good place to stop if we have comments.
Yeah, actually, we've got a pretty lively chat.
Good.
Quite a few people. Zach is here for the first time. Nilo Nostrum is here for the first time as well.
Thank you for joining us.
It Had to Be Said is over here on YouTube.
Hello.
Our good friend Some Random Geek made it.
Hey, it's great to see you. Thank you for being here.
And then Some Random Geek also said, I'm still salty that we only got $1,400 from Biden when he promised $2,000 checks.
Right. This is what I'm saying. And what's so crazy about that whole thing was that was what was predicated on those the Georgia Senate races in 2020, because they went to a runoff, and they said, if you elect, Warnock and Ossoff, we'll get you that extra money. And then they never did. And then essentially they did a form of national gaslighting where they said, oh, we never meant to give you the full 2,000. It was going to be 800 on top of the 1,200.
You got 600 already.
Yeah, you got this. Yeah. It was pretty shameless. Yeah,
for sure. Nilo Nostrum also said, never stop grinding the axe on that one, Some Random. And largest wealth transfer in history during COVID.
You're right. $3 trillion. $3 trillion. And we saw the explosive expansion of the net worth of people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, too.
Yeah. That's when they started talking about which one would reach trillionaire status.
Yeah.
Right? Some Random Geek also said, I'm also salty about liberals who said, I knew we were only getting $1,400, So even the progressive liberals are used to the Dems breaking their campaign promises.
Yeah, it's really crazy. But unfortunately, we have a politics in America where we have essentially sort of a centrist center-right party in the Democrats who their politics are not mine, but they're fundamentally not insane. And you have the Republican Party, which is absolutely, completely, totally batshit and insane.
Yeah.
So the options are not great. And so it's this every 2 to 4 years, it's always are you going to vote for Republicans? Come on. And trust me, I would never vote Republican in my life. But at the same time, it's at some point you have to give people a message. You actually have to follow through on some things.
Yeah.
And if they had never done the direct checks, maybe they could have done the thing which they should have done, which was make the expanded childhood tax credit permanent.
Yeah.
It was probably one of the most substantial anti-poverty programs that this country has taken on in the last 50 years, at least since Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. Lifted half of American children out of poverty overnight and was taken away because of Joe Manchin.
Yeah, essentially. Yep.
Yeah.
Velkin999 is just over here lurking.
Hello.
And then we got some random geek. Some random geek also said Bezos and Elon Musk and them racing to space with their penis spaceships.
It's true. We live in a system where if these two men can have a hearty competition on who can get their dick rocket highest in the air, I think that's a deeply unhealthy one. I mean, I think it speaks volumes about the level of inequality.
Yeah, for sure. Zach mentioned, I really hope Rick Perlstein does a book on Clinton.
He is. He sort of is. So Perlstein is writing a book right now on, I think the book is going to be called The Infernal Triangle. It's also the name of his column for the American Prospect. I think it's going to be over the last 20 to 25 years. So it'll probably be more about Bush than it will be about Clinton. But the Clinton stuff will play a key role, especially the late Clinton years. Again, that's when all the deregulation happens. And so, Perlstein should definitely write about that. If you want a good book that kind of goes into those things, though, that's sort of in the style of Rick Perlstein, I highly recommend checking out the book Listen Liberal by Thomas Frank. I've talked about Thomas Frank on the show before, but that book is an excellent history of how the Democratic Party went to absolute crap. It's done in that kind of fun, irreverent style that Perlstein has.
Nice. So keeping on going here, some random geek says, I hate that the fascist Thuglikins party is forcing us to vote for the other pro-genocide party.
Right. I mean, this is where we're at, right?
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is that that actually being more to the left on Palestine is actually good electorally. Most Americans actually support the United States stopping the shipping of weapons to Israel. I mean, there's good polling on this that suggests that if the Democrats actually went full force on the sort of the goals of the uncommitted campaign, which is of course part of the BDS movement and all that. Yeah. It would be good politics. I think it'd be very, very good politics, especially in swing states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. Those Midwestern states that have a large Muslim immigrant community. I think it would be very good for them, which goes to show you how little democratic input the system really has, that there's this huge divide between what the public believes and what the public wants and what the people in power end up actually doing. Yeah. Because in this sort of, in the neoliberal state, the power is held by corporate interests. It's not held by us. So we can go and vote for somebody. I mean, yes, I think on some specific things, like a Kamala Harris presidency would be better than a Trump presidency, right? But at the same time, it sort of limits our ability to do anything else. And I think it's kind of breaking out of that is, I think, crucial for a better form of politics.
It had to be said, asked, y'all think we might get a UBI in Canada?
That's interesting.
I don't think so.
No. And I will say this. So if a UBI happened in the United States, it would do so as a way to get rid of the welfare state. Right. That was what they would do.
Yeah,
Um,
even if like, I mean, we can't even seem to get the Liberal Party to, even if you get say like the Conservatives are not going to win, the Liberal Party won't even vote for a wealth tax of minuscule wealth tax.
yeah,
So a UBI seems unlikely to me, but I could be out of the loop. Like I haven't really,
yeah.
I don't pay that much attention to what the team politicians are saying these days.
What I would say is that the problem with the UBI is that it's ultimately kind of a regressive policy. And what I mean by that is a lot of the policy planners who advocated for it in, say, the 1970s, because the United States almost passed a UBI in the 1970s when Nixon was president. In fact, Nixon was willing to sign it, um, but it kind of died in Congress because the Democrats actually wanted more. They're like, this is not good enough. But at the time, I think it was called like the reverse income tax. It was an idea that was one of the biggest proponents was actually Milton Friedman, the neoliberal economist. And their argument was this would be in lieu of the welfare state, that you would
Right.
sort of get rid of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all that, food stamps, and you would replace it with a universal basic income.
And undoubtedly, if you did have something, then you'd have like all these like means testing and
Yes,
yes, everybody gets $2,000 a month, but not if you're in this situation or that situation, or if you're getting disability instead, then you don't get it, or
yes.
stuff like that. Like it wouldn't be actually universal, the same way our healthcare isn't actually universal.
Exactly. That's right. So I'd say on the left, our actual better demand is not universal basic income, but universal basic services. So what I mean by that is universal healthcare, universal childcare, universal housing, universal income. It's even broader, right? You make a bigger demand. Because that is ultimately, I think, a real policy changer. I think but I'm not going to say that a universal basic income is a bad idea. I think it's a good one. I just would say that it would be on top of other things. It would be a component of the broader um, enlargement of the broader enlarging of the welfare state as it currently exists. But you're right, Corey. Like it would be means tested to hell. It would be sort of income based. So there'd be people who'd fall kind of in the middle. They're too broke to make ends meet, but they make too much money to get benefits.
Yeah, yeah.
So they fall somewhere in the middle. That's a lot of folks. And they do that on purpose. I mean, it's by design. It's not, they don't have to do it that way. And what's interesting is that in order to do these kinds of things, you have to have a lot more bureaucracy to do it. Like you actually have to have more state intervention in order to do means testing nonsense. And if you just made a program universal.
Yeah, that's right.
A universal program is also a lot harder to get rid of, right? That's why for decades, despite the neoliberal assault on the welfare state, like they can't get rid of Social Security, they can't get rid of Medicare, and they can't get rid of Medicaid because they're universal programs. Everybody over the age of 65 gets Medicare. Everybody over the age of 65 gets Social Security. Anybody under a certain income gets Medicaid.
Right.
Like it's a basic. It is universal. It's all hard to get rid of that because everybody benefits that system. But yeah, I support UBI. I think it's a great step, but I would say go farther.
There's been quite a conversation about UBI in the chat.
Okay.
So, I don't know if you want to move on with the book or if we want to continue with the discussion.
We can do a little bit more on the UBI if you want.
All
to.
right. So I'll bring up a couple more comments.
Because I can try to tie it into the book.
So yeah, where are we? Some Random Geek. The only way we'll get a UBI in the US is with the Andrew Yang style. All benefits, services slashed, and everyone gets just $2,000 a month.
Yep, and rents would automatically go up. So
yeah, for sure.
All of that universal basic income would be eaten up by rent, which is kind of the other thing, right? Like that's kind of the other problem is that if you're going to have a UBI, you have to have rent control.
Okay, so yeah, they also said, believe me, as an anarcho-syndicalist communist, the UBI is not the end goal. I actually hate policies as I would quote David Graeber as he wrote in the last chapter of Bullshit Jobs.
Right. I mean, probably the most the most mainstream person who advocated for universal basic income was Andrew Yang, and his politics are
Or
pretty
garbage.
they're garbage. I mean, he has his politics are basically like the softer, nicer version of Elon Musk. So yeah.
Nilo Nostrum said, I've come across a few hints lately that UBI sort of comes from the anti-communist ideas of social democracy. The social credit idea that preceded UBI, which inspired it, was first proposed by people with anti-communist views like the reactionary AFL unions created in response to socialist unions.
That's right. As I said earlier, the idea of the UBI was originally conceived of as what was called the reverse income tax. In the United States, we have something similar to that. It's called the earned income tax credit. So every year, tax time, some people get a little money back, but it's predicated on your income. So like the more money you make, the more you'll get back in your return, which is not really the way it should be.
Right. Yeah, that seems off.
Yeah.
And then Zach said, where I live, there's a ballot measure to tax high-earning corporations and directly pay people, and both parties oppose it, and it's a blue state.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and so this is a really good point, and this gets us to the book too. So what we see is we hear this argument that socialism is like a planned economy, and planned economies are evil, and we shouldn't, because everybody will be in this like highly bureaucratized like 1984, where we're all drones and everything is awful and gray and terrible. The big lie that's at the center of neoliberalism is this idea that we live in a free market. That's not true. We live in an extremely planned economy from top to bottom. It's very, very planned. From the financial institutions that are very, very planned, that make very long-term decisions about how they're going to organize their wealth, to larger multinational corporations. Amazon is a great example of this. She has a chapter in the book where she talks about Amazon. Amazon internally is an extremely planned system. Workers there can't move without being monitored or tracked in some way. They're merely cogs in a machine. And Amazon actually has been very clear about how they prize like just churning people in and out of their system.
Right.
They're very comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And so we see the situation where the neoliberal state is a sort of hulking behemoth, but instead of it being in service of workers or the working class, it's in service of capital. It's in service of maintaining corporate power. And so you have something called regulatory capture, where industries are often, as we discussed earlier, right? Boeing had regulators on the books that technically worked for the FAA, but they were paid by Boeing. That's what regulatory capture is, where the regulatory agencies are not actually the cop on the beat, like taking care of criminals. They're the ones who are, I guess, kind of more like real cops, where they sort of take a paycheck and they sort of terrorize, regular people and make sure that capitalists get off scot-free.
Yeah. So
there's often a revolving door where, in America, lobbying, which is essentially graft, it's corruption. The reason why, if you look at like freedom indexes or corruption indexes, why the America has it's low on the index of corruption, is because in America, corruption is legal. And it's in the form of lobbying. Most corporations didn't spend a ton on lobbying until the 1970s, and that's really when it changes. Right. Coincidentally, the neoliberal turn happens in the 1970s. So lobbyists will end up working in federal or state agencies, then they leave, and then they go back into the private sector as a lobbyist, and they use their connections and their expertise that they gained within their government in order to get lucrative contracts. Yeah. This is a very common, very, very common story.
Yeah.
David Cameron, for example, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, this is his example that she has in the book. He worked for a company called G4S. And they were responsible for a lot of I think some of like the COVID, some of the COVID policy in the UK, and they were like a complete disaster. They were also a complete disaster during the Olympics. They were hired to do the Olympics, and they were paid millions of dollars by the government to do it. Ultimately, they couldn't even fulfill their basic responsibilities for security. And so the UK government had to call on the military to do the policing for the games. So this is a very common tale where there's this myth that in socialism, there's bureaucrat A, and then bureaucrat A leads to bureaucrat B and bureaucrat C. In some ways, that's true. If you look at the Soviet system, it was a heavily bureaucratized society. But I would argue in some ways that the United States or modern neoliberal states are worse in that they have all of the worst traits of sort of state socialism. And they have all of the worst traits of capitalism kind of all rolled into one.
Yeah.
I think it's what Mark Fisher once called market Stalinism, where you have just this incredible, impressive amount of bureaucracy, but it's in service of capital. It's in service of corporations.
Right.
So that's why healthcare is so expensive, because we have these private insurance industry.
Yeah.
And somebody has to get a cut. So that's why like a Band-Aid could cost you like $100 when you go into like the doctor's office or whatever, or in the ER or whatever. And it's terrible. I mean, I don't know. And it's deeply inefficient too. Like capitalism always says, oh, well, privatization, if you leave it to the market, then it'll be more efficient because there'll be competition, there'll be innovation. None of that's true.
Right.
Most innovations that have happened over the last 40 years, especially in relation to the internet, were ones that were paid for with public money. The internet was basically developed through public money. It was ARPANET. It was done through the defense industry, and then became the internet that we know today. The World Wide Web was developed by physicists. It was developed by Tim Berners-Lee. It was a universal one that was developed with public money and public research in order for people to share information with one another.
Yeah.
And same with smartphones, right? The capitalists, you always hear, you say this on your iPhone or whatever.
Right.
Most of the technology that's in an iPhone was funded with public research, right?
That's right.
The touchscreen that's on an iPhone, that's something that was developed with public research. So there's all kinds of technologies that were actually publicly funded. The COVID vaccine is a great example of this,
yes,
right? The public vaccine was developed in public labs with public money. And yet somehow it still ended up being privatized.
Yeah, it ended up in private hands.
And put into private hands. And there was a form of vaccine apartheid, where other poor or developing countries were not allowed to manufacture the vaccine because of intellectual property law.
And then capitalist hacks who have no relation to vaccines except for money, like Bill Gates, to decide that the patent can't go outside of it can't be free patented or free use.
And he ultimately falls back on the racist argument that, well, they're just not sophisticated enough to make it up to our standards. I'm like, I'm sorry, excuse me. So you don't think they could do it? I'm sorry. Countries like India, Bangladesh, China, Vietnam, like Cambodia, all these countries make everything that we wear or we use every day. So you don't think that they could handle making a vaccine? They can make all kinds of stuff. That just is infuriating. So you have
and meanwhile, Cuba totally developed their own vaccine and made one that was more efficient than the one that was developed in America. Yeah.
China did one too. And so the other thing to think about too is how this is related to the state. So in our pregame, we were sort of talking about the state is intimately connected with capitalism. In order to get rid of the state, you have to get rid of capitalism, because they're both predicated on hierarchy, domination, and the fundamental relationship between those who give out orders and those who have to take them.
Yeah.
That's that fundamental relationship. In the book, she talks about how the state is not sort of this like bulking behemoth that kind of sits on top of society the way that neoliberals often talk about it. It's actually more a system of interrelated institutions that constitute the state. And those are interrelated in terms of how they exercise power. So, your local post office and the Department of Defense are both the state, right? But they serve very different functions.
Right.
And what we see time and again is that neoliberalism and this whole idea of deregulation or trickle-down economics or whatever all of whatever you want to call it, its whole thing is that we're getting rid of government, but it never actually does.
Oh.
It's actually, deregulation isn't really deregulation. It's re-regulation. It's regulating in service of the corporations that pay for people's campaigns, right? You also see a sense in which corporate capture of elections is very clear in the United States, going all the way back to the 1970s with Buckley v. Vallejo, which said that money was speech. And then you have Citizens United in 2010, which then expands that even more in the sense that corporations are people. Because that's the thing. In the United States and under international trade law broadly, corporations have more rights than human beings. They just do. And so when we think about free trade, it's not really free trade, right? It's not free trade at all. The rules are set by the dominant countries in cooperation with multinational corporations. It's not something where it's free for those at the top. It's free for those in power.
Right.
And so the state isn't like something that it's not the state versus the economy, like, which is kind of the paradigm that we often hear. Right. It's like more state means less freedom, or more economy means more freedom. Like, no, like the other thing to keep in mind too is that socialism is not when the government does stuff. This is a very common misunderstanding. That's not socialism. Socialism is worker ownership of the means of production and exchange. It's participatory, democratic economy and society. That's what socialism is. So just nationalizing something in and of itself does not necessarily mean that that will be democratic.
Right.
Or that it's beneficial, right? Because a lot of times when a company is nationalized, say in the case of the banks during the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of the same people who were at the top, who were responsible for the failures in the first place, stayed at the top. They stayed in power. Or they ended up back in government, which is the case of people like Lawrence Summers or, Robert Rubin, or a lot of the people who were a part of the Clinton era deregulation of the financial industry. So the state is something that is inexorably tied to the government. You can't, or tied to capitalism rather. You can't get rid of one without getting rid of the other. And so I think that this idea that, neoliberalism means, less government and more markets. It's like, no. And we also don't really live in a free market. Like, free markets are a fiction. The reason for that is because we've seen in my lifetime, the amount of corporate consolidation is insane.
Yeah.
So a good example is what's on my shirt, Star Trek. Star Trek was originally owned by Desilu Productions, which was Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball's production company.
Oh, nice.
I Love Lucy is why we have Star Trek. Lucille Ball is kind of the godmother of Star Trek. She put her own money into developing the pilot for Star Trek. But Star Trek in the 1970s, its ownership was changed over to Paramount. At the time, Paramount is a movie studio, still exists today. It was owned by a company called Gulf and Western, which was this multinational conglomerate that owned all kinds of different things. Then in the 1990s, it became merged with a company called Viacom.
Mm-hmm.
And then most recently, CBS Paramount, or Paramount Global, which owns Paramount, CBS, and all these other networks, recently merged with another production company called Skydance. So we're seeing again and again how something as innocuous as Star Trek is now being held in fewer and fewer hands because of corporate consolidation.
Yeah.
When most of the media that we consume is generated by 4 or 5 different major corporations. It's not, very little of it is developed independently. Although, please support independent media. That's what we are. That's what we do. But we see this corporate consolidation all the time, and it's signed off by the Justice Department, despite the fact that we have very strong antitrust laws in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's always because, like, it's down to who decides if it actually qualifies as violating antitrust, right?
Exactly. So we see time and time again, from the Amazon warehouse to the T-shirt that you wear, to the food that you eat. It's controlled by fewer and fewer hands.
Yeah.
And often they're colluding with one another, right? So we talked a little bit about this in the Choke Point Capitalism episode, Cory Doctorow and Rebecca Giblin's book, where we talked about how they were often in collusion with one another and they would set prices.
Yeah.
So, and capitalism lends itself towards this over time. Like this idea that in order for capitalism to work the way that neoliberals say it does, where it's like a free market with competition and innovation, you have to have an incredible amount of state intervention in order to achieve that. You'd have to have antitrust law to break up bigger firms into smaller ones so they would actually have to compete on a market.
Yeah.
You'd have to have public investment into research and development because over the decades, we've seen research and development costs within firms go down, down, down as public expenditures for bailouts go up and up.
Right.
So we see a system that is deeply, deeply planned. We have a very, very little degree of freedom in this system. Contrary to what the trickle-downers and the neoliberals will tell you, we live in a system that is deeply unfree, where so much of what we are allowed to do, what we're allowed to eat, what we're allowed to wear, what we're allowed to say, is determined by a very large, overweening government, which is in league with multinational corporations in the service of capital. I know sometimes that sounds very like tinfoil hat, but it's true.
But it's literally just the way it is.
It's just the way it is. And so, what is the solution to this? The solution to this is what she calls democratic planning or socialism. She has this really interesting story about something called the Lucas Aerospace Corporation in the 1970s, which was in Britain. And it was under hard times. It was not doing particularly well. And there was an idea that was put together called the Lucas Plan. And the Lucas Plan was giving the company to the workers. And what they wanted to do was pretty incredible. What they wanted to do was they wanted to buy it from the owners of the company. And then from there, what they would do is they were going to divest completely from making weapons because as Lucas Aerospace made defense, they fulfilled defense contracts.
Okay.
They would divest from defense and they would put their hopes into and their production into socially responsible and socially useful products. They were even discussions of doing high-speed rail in the 1970s under the Lucas Plan. This even had the support of Tony Benn, longtime Labor MP back when Labor was actually a pro-worker party. And he was I think he was the finance minister at the time in the 1970s. But unfortunately, it never really got off the ground. But other democratic institutions did. And so she has numerous examples in the book about people-powered planning, all of these different types of democratizing, democratic planning where people work together in their communities and made a difference. And some of these were on the small scale, but they were extremely effective. So she talks about in Australia, there was something called the Green Bands, where these organizations came together with some early environmentalist groups, and they democratically worked together to block development on very crucial lands in Australia, particularly like coastal regions and coral reefs. You have the People's Plan for the Royal Docks in the 1980s. That was going to be, it was another idea of sort of, collective democratic ownership of the docks. You had something in Brazil called participatory budgeting, where the regular everyday people were more involved in the direct financial decisions of their cities, which led to a huge amount of increases in social spending, while at the same time you would see decreases in the spending for cops. Because here's the thing, when you build a city that kind of works and people have jobs and people don't feel so precarious, you don't need all that many cops because the crime goes down. She talks about the People's Planning in Kerala, which is a state in India, which is run by the Communist Party, and they developed something called the State Planning Board, and they increased their health spending in public health facilities from 20% in 1991 to 48% by 2018. Their poverty went from 25% in the early 90s to 6% in 2011. So again, it's democratic planning where the citizenry was actively engaged in making economic decisions. In the United States, there's something called Cooperation Jackson, which is in Mississippi, which is another organization that's predicated on participatory democratic planning that has been, I think, extremely successful. And so there's example after example after example.
Yeah.
And so how do we get there? How do we build this world? The way that we build this is through taking back bit by bit our democratic society.
Yeah.
It's through organizing, it's through mutual aid, it's through solidarity.
Yeah.
We work together to solve these problems. And we can do them on a large scale. She talks about how one of the great examples in the book of democratic planning done on a very large scale is Cybersyn, which was the plan that was developed in Chile under the democratic socialist government of Dr. Salvador Allende in the early 1970s. They didn't have a lot to work with, but they actually hooked up a series of telex machines. For those who don't know, telex machines are even way before you and Ma time.
Yeah.
But telex machines were like these systems where you could basically do faxes, and you could send a fax and send real-time economic data. This is what Cybersyn did. They would send real-time economic data to the central planning authority, and then they would sort of give feedback to more worker-owned firms within Chile. Now, unfortunately, we know the sad story of what happened with Chile in 1973. Today is September 10th, so tomorrow is the September 11th is the 51st anniversary of the overthrow of the coup that happened in Chile, which led to the death of Allende and the installation of Augusto Pinochet, the horrific dictator who, under his rule, displaced tens of thousands of those who were part of Allende's movement. But Cybersyn is an example of large-scale planning. Now, Blakeley makes a great point that, was it as democratic as we'd like it to be? No. But it was a very good example of you had a democratically elected leader in Allende, you had democratically elected officials who were putting together a system that worked directly with workers in order to do nationwide economic planning. It's possible.
Yeah.
And as we've talked about with the People's Republic of Walmart, these are deeply Walmart or Amazon, a lot of these huge multinationals, they're very, very, very planned on the inside, right?
Yeah.
So it's very easy to do that. Same with the internet. I mean, the internet was a public demand. It was a public good, right? It was, like I said earlier, it was ARPANET. But you have to organize for it. You have to. Then there are different organizations that she sort of talks about. She talks about the Debt Collective, which is fantastic here in the U.S. that has been at the forefront of arguing for canceling medical debt, and they've even done some of it.
Nice.
Where there have been debt jubilee. There was an organization called Strike Debt, which wiped out $13.5 million in medical debt, $1.2 million in personal debt, and $3.8 million in student loans. Because the way that they do it is you're like, oh my God, do they have to raise those millions? No. So you can buy collateralized debt for pennies on the dollar.
Yeah.
So, you can buy the medical debt of, say, how many thousands of people, and it might be worth millions, but you may only pay $40,000 or $50,000 for it.
Right.
But you own that debt, and then you can wipe it out. In fact, years ago, John Oliver on an episode of Last Week Tonight did this, where he talked about debt buyers and people who this sort of extremely predatory industry, and he bought some, and it was like $30 million of medical debt or something like that. It was huge. And he made the joke at the time. He's like, I'm doing the single largest giveaway in television history. Take that, Oprah, because he was like referencing her giving everybody a car.
Right.
But again, they only paid pennies on the dollar for that debt.
Right.
It's very easy to wipe it out, right? So that's what the Debt Collective is about. We have an international economic system, and that's a lot more in the book that she talks about that we didn't get into, whether it's the neocolonialism in Africa or in Latin America, where there's so much the strangulation of those societies via debt, and via like the international monetary funds, like structural adjustment programs, where it's like cut social spending, raise,
they insist on certain policies in order
austerity,
to,
right? And so the organizers who organized against the Keystone XL pipeline, the water protectors, were ultimately successful. And the Extinction Rebellion protests, I think, have been immensely successful in terms of getting climate change again back on the map, thinking about it in terms of what is going on with our environment, making the case for this. And I'm really sorry that some, uppity rich fuckers' art got messed up. I don't really give a shit. First off, most of it's behind a glass wall.
That's right. Most of it didn't get messed up at all.
And so ultimately she makes the strong argument for the growth of unions. And as do I think that a lot, especially in the US, one of the ways that we can really truly grow worker power is through the unions, despite their limitations. But we should. And as she mentions too, like I mentioned earlier, like it's not enough to have UBI, you have to have universal basic services. And so we can do those kinds of things. She has a really interesting section on democratizing finance where she talks about a people's asset manager, or a PAM. So people's asset managers would be kind of like BlackRock, but they would be run democratically. Imagine a sort of public-owned, democratically controlled investment institution that could invest in good and socially useful businesses like high-speed rail, solar panels, wind turbines, carbon capture technology, fusion technology, any of those things that our capitalist state currently under neoliberalism just doesn't really put a lot of money into, right?
Yeah.
And so people's asset manager could really be a huge change in terms of how we could sort of shift resources. And it's growing democracy. It ultimately comes down to growing democracy. In the United States, for example, we have a bicameral legislature, a House and a Senate. One of the ways that you make it more democratic right off the bat is you could abolish the Senate. You could have a unicameral legislature where you have a House, and that's it. But in lieu of that, which would probably be the better way to do it, in the UK they have the House of Lords. You could abolish that too.
Right.
One thing I've advocated for a long time is actually expanding congressional terms. So like in the US, we have 2-year House terms. That's no time to do anything. The first year you're learning how to do the job. The second year you're having to campaign to keep it. So it would be better if we had more of a parliamentary system where House terms were 4 and Senate terms were 4. And so they were all elected on the same 4-year cycle, right? Because Senate terms in the US are 6. So what if House and Senate terms are the same length?
Right.
Then you could also have term limits. So after 2 terms,
you're out.
You could be done.
Yeah.
One thing that we also talk about that's a very big deal is recall. Public officials should be subject to recall at any time, and elected officials should know that that's the case. Now that democratic impulse can be hijacked for nefarious purposes.
It can.
Like the recall election against Gavin Newsom in California, or the one against Gray Davis in California, which ultimately led to Arnold Schwarzenegger being elected governor, which was all based on a artificially created blackout by Enron. If you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend people check out the documentary, The Smartest Guys in the Room. It's fantastic. And it goes into all of the nastiness about that whole situation in California. But yeah, so, we need increased worker power. We need increased state power in the sense that we need to democratize the state with the ultimate goal, I think, of getting rid of it. Right. I mean, and as you said in our pregame, and I think you're right, is that you can't really get rid of the state with the state. And I think that's true. But what you can do is ultimately use the power of democracy to end systems of hierarchy and domination and oppression. And the way that you do that is through increased participation of the people.
Right.
I'm a firm believer that most people know what's best for them. I really do. I think most people know that. I don't think most people are stupid. I don't think you have to herd them. I feel like all of that kind of language is in the service of those who wish to oppress us.
Yeah.
I think most people know it's in their self-interest to help one another and to care for one another. And so that's how we can do that, is by sort of building a new world that would be sort of not limited by these artificial constraints that neoliberalism has put on us. As I mentioned in the pregame, I do think that we're living in an era where the neoliberal order is kind of breaking down.
Yeah.
It's clearly not working particularly well. We're seeing an increasing divide between what the public actually wants and what elected officials actually do. We've seen this most recently in France, where the popular left coalition won the election, and yet they're not going to actually be in power despite them winning the election, like they won. But Macron is a dictator, so he kind of gets to do what he wants. If Macron was in Latin America, the U.S. would have cooed him by now.
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
You know, if he was in Latin America, and it was maybe a shade darker, I think they probably would have thrown him out. But it's interesting how those double standards exist, because again, it's like because Macron is a sort of compliant
that's right.
operative of the neoliberal state. So it's, of course, that's what he's going to do. I think this is a wonderful book. There's so much more to talk about. She crams in a lot of really interesting stuff about a lot of key Marxist thinkers like Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, Rudolf Hilferding and Finance Capital. She talks a little bit about Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy's work about economic formation. There's a lot of really interesting economic stuff in this book that you can really kind of sink your teeth into and really get into the details, and I highly recommend people do that. Ultimately, what she's arguing for is participatory economy, as Michael Albert calls it. And it's what I want. I mean, that's what I think we should all want, is a world where we're collectively making those decisions together.
Yeah.
And we're including the people, because that's what democracy is. That's what it should be. And what we live in isn't particularly democratic.
That's
and
like
so it's
what
time
it
for
actually
something new.
means, right? Like the rule of the people.
Rule of the people, but it's not, right? Because in the system we live in, we live under a high degree of unfreedom precisely because there is no democracy in the workplace. Unless you belong to a union, or you work for a workers' cooperative, there's really no freedom for you. And so we have to combat the lie that socialism means a lack of freedom, or a more planned economy is something that is a lack of freedom. Because, like, first off, we already live in a planned economy, a deeply planned economy, and it is deeply unfree. But it's not unfree because it's planned. It's unfree because it is planned by plutocrats and oligarchs. It's not planned by the people.
Yeah.
So that's Vulture Capitalism. I love this book. I think she's fantastic. She also did a very good interview with Aaron Bastani of Novara Media. So if you want to check that out, I highly recommend people do that.
Cool.
And definitely read the book, because I think it's worthwhile. And she really gets into the real meat of the argument about freedom. And that, because we on the left, we actually care about human freedom. We're the ones who actually care about freedom.
Actual liberty, not whatever the fuck they're talking about.
Right. Which is the right to exploit the earth and to exploit others.
Yeah.
That's really what they mean. So definitely check it out.
Right on. So I guess, what are we covering next time?
So next time we are covering another fairly recent book, and we're going to be doing Naomi Klein's Doppelganger.
Oh, nice.
I'm very, very excited because you've read that book, right?
I have.
Very good. Very good. So that'll be a fun discussion. Yep. And then after that, we will be doing another book about degrowth. I decided to go ahead and we're going to do Kohei Saito's new book, Slow Down.
Oh, cool.
The Japanese Marxist has very interesting readings of Marx that have been very controversial. So we'll kind of, and in relationship to ecology. So we'll be talking about degrowth again, because I'm very interested in the topic after reading Jason Hickel's book. So those will be the next couple books we'll cover on the show.
Nice. And I guess all that leaves is, where can people find you?
You can find me at justinclark.org. My website's right down there. I'm working on a couple of different essays right now. One is a retrospective on Green Day's American Idiot, which turns 20 years old this year, and kind of talking about its influence on me and sort of its relationship to the early 20th century and the early 21st century and the Bush years, and how I think they do Green Day always does a very good job of sort of blending the personal and the political.
Yeah.
And then the other essay that I'm going to be working on, which will also be a talk that I'll be doing later in the fall, is about how do we humanize technology. And we're going to be, I'm using the work of Eric Fromm to kind of unpack that. He wrote a great book in the 60s called The Revolution of Hope,
Nice.
which is all about humanizing technology. And I think that's very relevant in our discussion as it relates to, say, AI or any other sort of development in technology. We'll also cover that on the show. We're going to do an episode on that book too, but there will also be an essay as well. So kind of keep your eyes peeled for that. And I'm still publishing on my blog the sort of short book reviews that I do of other books that we don't talk about on the show.
Right on. I was just looking at your blog. I think it's the most recent one. You had like 5 books you covered, like A Dollarocracy was one of them.
Yeah. Dollarocracy is a great book. That essay, that blog of the little collection is called, I think it's called Politics in the American Empire. And so Dollarocracy is a fantastic book. I really like that book a lot.
Right
Bob McChesney and John Nichols, those guys are great. Definitely check that out as well. And as always, please consider becoming a patron, patreon.com/skeptical leftists. Corey has been doing a tremendous amount of really interesting work, not just the shows with Red Reviews, but he's been doing some really great interviews. He's been working on some essays. For patrons, he just released an essay about human nature, which I read and really, really enjoyed. Talked about a lot of the themes that we talked about in the main show and in other discussions that we've had. And it allows us to keep the lights on. We do this as a labor of love in many ways, but any support is greatly, greatly appreciated.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody in the chat. This was fantastic. Just watching the comments
very,
up
very
and
much.
down. Like I love that. I love seeing participation there.
And I also want to do a quick shout out. Thank you to Grace Blakeley for sharing out my story about our episode tonight in her story. So that's maybe how we got a few more people too. So thanks, Grace, for doing that. Your book is fantastic. I'm a huge fan.
Right on. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. And thank you, Justin, for reading the book and taking us through it.
Thank you so much.
All right, folks. That's all for now. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me keep the power on. Thanks to my top patrons, Damian Marie Athope, Some Random Geek, Justin Clark, Dan F. Smith, and Lisa Glass. And thank you to my new patrons. You can stay tuned for the list of patrons at the end to see your name listed. If you aren't a patron and want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send a one-time donation to buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. I also have a Substack where you can subscribe for free or you can donate per month. And lastly, you can get a paid subscription on Spotify that will give you the same access to bonus content and extra long episodes. If you can't contribute financially, then I would like on YouTube or a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out the show notes for links to all my stuff, or check out my link tree. It's linktr.ee/skepticalleftist. That's where you can find all of my social media spaces and communities. You can also email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening or watching. Make sure to leave a comment on the video, join your local org, print off some posters or pamphlets, and spread the propaganda. Also, stick around for a clip from this episode's post-show chat.
Socialism is economic democracy.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Yeah. It's expanding the realm of what democratic debate and input is about to the realm of production and consumption of goods. That's what socialism is.
Yeah.
So when we think about it in that regard, yes, you could say you could have a state which was in the service of building socialism. So, for example, you could say have like a dictatorship of the proletariat where its goal was, we're going to buy up all of these enterprises and then we're going to give them back to the workers.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
we're going to legalize trade unions and we're going to provide them with some kind of maybe state stipend to develop their capacity.
You're not going to achieve it by establishing a hierarchy and a bureaucracy that is maintaining itself. It always has to be in the effort of disbanding itself and spreading the power throughout the community.
Right, which is the core contradiction when you think of people like a lot of neoliberals, when you think of people like Reagan, right?
Yeah.
Where he's like, the government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. It's like, but you are the government.
Yeah,
so like,
that's right.
So you are, in effect, the problem. And he was the problem.
In fact,
I mean,